Good afternoon. I'm here with my guest, John Canaday. He's a poet, and welcome aboard here.
Thank you.
He doesn't get out much, but he did come out to poet, writer. You're the author of The Invisible World, Poems and the Nuclear Muse, Literature, Physics, and the First Atomic Bombs. Poetry has been published in a lot of prestigious places, soon to be maybe in Ibsen Street, right? There you go. And your latest book is Critical Assembly, Poems of the Manhattan Project. So I would think initially, I said, that's an unlikely subject. But where did you get the idea? I mean, I know you've written about the nuclear muse and other things like that, the literature. For instance, I just know John Hershey's Hiroshima and things like that. I'm sure you're familiar with a lot more.
Absolutely. That was an inspiration, among other things, yeah.
So what is this obsession with and poetry about it?
I think it does border on an obsession. I've been working on it for over 30 years, amongst other projects. And the origin of it was actually in a class that I took in college. We were studying the
Where did you go to college?
At Middlebury in Vermont. And we were studying the Second World War, and among the topics was the development of the atomic bombs. And we conducted mock Nuremberg trials as if the Allies had lost. And I was assigned the role of Oppenheimer and was put on trial as one of the principal agents designing the bombs. Oppenheimer was the director of the Los Alamos laboratory where the bombs were developed. So that first stimulated my interest. I also minored in physics, and so I was very interested in physics to begin with. And I was curious as to whether there were ways of combining these various interests. I was writing poetry, I was studying the physics. And then after college, I spent a year living in England on a Watson Fellowship. And during that time, there was a great deal of tension, as you may remember, between the United States and the Soviet Union, and a lot of rhetoric flying back and forth, and I found myself imagining the ICBMs flying back and forth and thinking, this is something that we need to address. This is something that we all need to find our own ways of addressing, but what can poetry do? So I thought about that, and I realized that one of the great powers that poetry has is to express the nuances of our psychology, of our own, of other people's. And the techniques of poetry have developed over the millennia: line breaks, enjambment, playing with rhythm, rhymes, and so forth. It's a very complex and subtle set of tools that allow us to represent our internal space, our internal states of mind. And all of the histories that I had read about the Manhattan Project, all the works that I had encountered about nuclear weapons, they were all large scale. They were all about the history and the shape of this grand transformation of our society, of our world. And I thought, well, maybe poetry would offer us a different way into this. Maybe by looking at the individuals who were involved, by trying to understand their feelings, their
Reminds me, now the name escapes me. In a way, it's sort of like, not Winesburg, Ohio, but the other one, Spoonville.
Oh, yeah, Edgar Lee Masters.
The Spoon River Anthology,
yeah,
right? There's individual people.
Absolutely. In that case, those are imaginary individuals.
Right, these are real.
Yeah, so, and these are
But they're
real.
talking heads.
Exactly,
right?
So it's very similar in that you're creating a sense of the interaction of many individuals by looking at each one individually. And so ideally what's going to happen is that they're going to start talking to each other, and that by looking at a number of them together, you're not just going to get a sense of what was driving these individuals to do what they did, but what were the larger historical forces that brought them together, and how did each of them contribute to that, fit into that, how were they motivated by that?
Now, Robert Oppenheimer, you know, he wrote about guys like Oppenheimer, of course, and Teller and all that. But what I like is because, like what I liked also was you focused on the common man. You know, the secretary, the security officer,
Absolutely.
the rancher. Tell me about why.
Well, because without them, this wouldn't have happened. There were countless individuals, the spouses, who were there supporting.
I mean, these physicists seemed to be living in their head. They were walking around, and you know, they didn't have any, they were brilliant, but they didn't have any common sense. It seemed in some cases.
Well, I'm sure that was the case. They were
Yeah,
human beings.
yeah.
Some of us don't have common sense. What I've been struck by is how thoughtful they are, by and large. I've run into only a few individuals, I would say, who weren't really being tremendously thoughtful about what they were doing, and
Yet you start out with Einstein, who sort of condemns these individuals in a way.
well, ironically, Einstein was one of the instigators
Right.
of the project. He wrote a letter along with Leo Szilard to Franklin Roosevelt in 1939 saying, there are these new possibilities that physicists have been discovering, and they could result in weapons of drastically new levels of power. You need to look into this. There's evidence that the Germans are looking into this. And that was one of the motivations that actually started the Manhattan Project going. And that, I think, that experience that he first said, you got to look at this, you got to think about doing this, and then later said, the unleashed power of the atom has changed everything, save our modes of thinking, and we thus drift toward unparalleled catastrophe. Right? That was Einstein's feeling later. You know, what happened in between? How can a single individual feel both of these things? That was very common for the scientists involved. It wasn't that they were, certainly not these bloodthirsty individuals saying, you know, we must win at any cost. You know, many of them were pacifists. Many of them were refugees from Nazi Germany.
With frailties, physical frailties and emotional frailties like us all.
Absolutely, like all of us.
I remember one gentleman walked with a limp, and who was that again?
Absolutely. Well, Edward Teller had lost a foot in a tram accident when he was a younger man, so he had a prosthesis, and that caused him to walk with a limp. So, you know, like any population, there were 6,000 people gathered at Los Alamos to develop these weapons. It was a community that was made out of nothing by the Army Corps of Engineers. And it wasn't just scientists there. It was their spouses. It was their children. There were maids. There were laborers. There were people stoking the furnaces. There were people who had been drafted into the military, and then it was discovered that they had some technical skills, and so they were brought on board. They were still part of the military, but they were there at Los Alamos working in the laboratories side by side with the scientists. Many people who became scientists got their start there. They had a little engineering as an undergraduate. They may not have finished their degree, but they were brought into Los Alamos. They were working side by side with Nobel Prize winners, and they were inspired then after the war to go to college and to have scientific careers.
You know, I got into some of the drama there, and some of the wives seemed neglected. Maybe they would succumb to alcoholism.
That's interesting. There was a great deal of alcohol consumption by many individuals, scientists and spouses and so forth. I haven't run into many cases of overt alcoholism, but it may just be because they weren't talking about it. But also, although there were frustrations, many frustrations, try to get a fresh vegetable up there, try to get fresh water on many occasions. There were water shortages. There were shortages of everything. It was really, in many ways, like living in a frontier town for these people. And that's why I say the bomb wouldn't have been built without all of these people, without the wives who were there, feeding their husbands, finding ways to keep the household going. So there were many frustrations, but it was, in many respects, a magical community, for the people who were involved. And I think that's one of the interesting features, one of the forces, you might almost say, that allowed this to happen, that allowed them to be part of building these weapons.
Well, you know, they were building these, what I noticed is that they were building these nefarious machines of war, but also you had the beauty of the landscape also.
Yes,
they were both
absolutely.
interplaying, right?
Yes, you had the beauty of the landscape. You also had the beauty of the physics.
Yeah.
And of the chemistry and of the metallurgy. These were technically, as Robert Oppenheimer once said, these were technically sweet problems. And so they were inspiring to the individuals. And you get it, there was no other community in the world, not even close, to having the concentration of great minds together, all devoted to the single purpose, all pushing the boundaries of their discipline, of this science that they loved, that they were pouring their hearts into. So there was I think there was a strong spiritual component to this for many of them. Robert Oppenheimer once said that his two great loves were physics and desert country, and it was a pity they couldn't be combined. Well, he ended up doing it, and he was right, that those two things in conjunction created a remarkable atmosphere.
Even the bomb itself, when it explodes, there's a certain beauty to it, isn't there?
Well, it depends very much on your perspective, and some of the witnesses, who were not obviously maimed and killed by it, but some of the witnesses describe it in terms that are beautiful. Victor Weisskopf, for example, thought of the Colmar altarpiece of Christ ascending.
Yeah.
And if he recognized the irony and the horror of that comparison, and yet there was still that that feeling that he had. That was his first response. Robert Oppenheimer thought of Vishnu taking on his multi-armed form of Shiva, and declaring, "I am become death, destroyer of worlds." You know, there's a horror to that, but there's also a magnificence to it as well. It's a very stirring thing to say. Otto Frisch, his first thought was it looked like a red-hot elephant standing up ended on its trunk, right? So there were people who saw absurdity in it, people who saw beauty in it, people who saw horror in it, and all of those things are correct. And I don't think that we can understand it if we don't encompass all of those things. And that's one of my hopes in the book, is by looking at all of these different individuals with their quirky responses, that together, taken together, we might start to understand a little more, how can individual human beings participate in something like this? How can they do something of this scale, this horror, this immensity?
Now, you did a lot of research. I mean, I just looking at the notes and stuff like that. I mean, to what extent? I mean, did you travel? Did you go to different archives and things of that nature?
I've visited archives across the country, the most important at the Los Alamos National Laboratory, which maintains a wonderful archive. The Los Alamos Historical Society also has a separate
They have this book, I imagine.
Archive. I think so. I hope so.
Yeah.
And the American Institute of Physics, the Niels Bohr Library in New York. And I've written to other archives and gotten material from them. I've been to reunions at Los Alamos, both of the military personnel and of the scientific personnel. They hold them separately or held them separately. I've visited the Trinity test site with scientists who were there for the original test. There are obviously hundreds and hundreds of books and articles and interviews out there. I've tried to read, I think I've read all the books. I've tried to read as many of the other materials as possible. I've corresponded with and interviewed many of the participants in the project. So, over the course of this 30-plus
Did you keep any of the interviews that you did?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So you can archive them somewhere, I imagine.
If someone's ever interested in them, absolutely. There are some wonderful interviews already in the archives, and they tend to focus on the history of physics and what was going on in terms of the scientific development at the time. There are also, many personal anecdotes. My interviews were trying to supplement that, so I focused more on the individual experiences that they had, the interactions that they had with other people, their reaction to the landscape. What did you think when you saw the Trinity test? Things like that.
Wow. By the way, we wanted to buy this book. It's on Amazon.com. Your publisher again is
University of New Mexico Press.
Okay,
Yeah.
so they can probably get it from
their website. Absolutely, they have it
And
available.
you've been doing readings and things like that. Well, do you have a website of your own?
I do.
Yeah.
It's johncanaday.com.
Say that once more.
johncanaday.com. And then
Canaday, right?
That's right, like the country
Yeah.
Canada with a Y ended up.
And how about readings? Are you doing any readings at all?
I'll be doing a couple of readings coming up. One at the Aeronaut Brewing, which is
Oh,
sponsored
yeah,
by
that's
Porter
right down
Square
there.
Books,
Yeah, I've been there.
Yeah, and one at the MIT Press bookstore.
Okay.
Yeah, both of those coming up.
Oh, that's great. And sales are going okay?
I guess so.
I mean, has there ever been a book like this? I mean, poetry of the...
Not that I'm aware of. W.D. Snodgrass wrote The Fuhrer Bunker, which is a collection of poems in the voices of some of the Nazis, Goebbels and Hitler and so forth. It's a very different style. I think that his intent was quite different in his book. Other than that, but treating this topic, no, I don't know of anything else that's
like it.
this.
Yeah.
It's an odd duck. There's no question.
Yeah, it's definitely an odd duck, and it's an interesting duck. You got about, let's see, 12, 13 minutes to read from your work.
Great,
So
I'd love to.
whatever you want.
So one of the challenges of writing these poems is that obviously they involve a lot of history, and I don't want to weight them down with the history. So I've tried to make each one.
Well, look, I didn't have a great knowledge of this, but I was able to
Good.
enjoy it.
How much did you consult the notes at the back of the
None,
book?
not really.
Okay,
No, just
good.
a few times, just to see who exactly the players were.
Well, you're my ideal reader then. I
Yeah,
think,
just a
because-
guy who picking up a book of poetry. I know some general history of what of course, I heard of Oppenheimer and the others, but I was able to, because they're human beings, and there's a universality about each and.
Well, that was my hope, but certainly there are many facts that can enrich
Yeah.
a reading of each poem. So I've included those in the back. I'm going to start with a poem in the voice of Richard Feynman.
Okay.
He-
Tell us who he was again. He was the
Yeah.
physicist.
He was a physicist. He was the youngest group leader at Los Alamos. He went on to win a Nobel Prize. And in this poem, he is remembering stopping on his way up the Los Alamos Mesa for the first time when he was going to join the project. And he reflects on this undertaking that he's about to begin. And he also thinks about his wife, Arlene, who is in a tuberculosis ward in a sanatorium in Albuquerque. And she would die shortly before the Trinity test. Richard Feynman. Once people thought that angels beat their wings to push the earth in its ordained track around the sun, as easily as we might move a blackboard covered with Serber's latest figures. That view has now been somewhat modified. The blank, unassuming face of a blackboard makes it easier to calculate the sun's mass, and gravity's figures speak louder than the handful of earth in a man. Numbers don't change their minds like people or angels. As a boy, I thought I'd been left on Earth by aliens. I could figure the rotational velocity of a change-up, but my aim was a radian off. While the sun arced through the blue vault like an angel, I scrawled resonance equations on a blackboard. On my first drive up to Los Alamos, the sun on cottonwoods and sandstone transformed me. I'd been thinking of Arlene in the TB ward in Albuquerque. The doctors figured she had a year. My heart was a blackboard, covered in odds. The naked earth rose before me then, like the figure of an angel. I could spend my life slaving at a blackboard and never quantify the way light shifted in her eyes. I lay down on a bare patch of earth to think. My chest was heavy with sun. I chose the smaller job, alter the course of a war. Armed with a blackboard, I would earn my place on earth. Behind me, an angel beat her wings. I circled the sun with a lasso of figures. So as we said before, the landscape was obviously a major character in this undertaking. It, I think, contributed to their ability to feel that what they were doing was noble. In the words of Robert Wilson, who ran the cyclotron at Los Alamos, it gave them the verisimilitude of high moral purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So this next poem is in the voice of a very different person. This is one of the more peripheral people, Edith Warner. She was a Philadelphian who had come to New Mexico years earlier to recover from some mysterious illness, and she had fallen in love with the landscape. And in order to stay there, she had opened a tea room by the Rio Grande River. She managed to eke out a living doing that. When the war came, her business dried up, and she thought she was going to have to pack it in. But Robert Oppenheimer stopped by one day, and he said, I'm going to make a deal with you. If you will serve only people from Los Alamos, I will give you as much business as you can handle. And so she agreed to that. And almost every night, a small group of scientists from Los Alamos would come down the mesa to her tea room by the Rio Grande, and she would feed them. So she hosted Niels Bohr. She hosted Robert Oppenheimer. She hosted Victor Weisskopf. And she became friends with many of these people. So this poem comes reasonably early in the book, and one of the things I hope to convey through it is to give a sense of what the landscape was like and why it was such a powerful influence on people. Edith Warner. Who needed mountains? What use? The desert's blank rock silences. For half my life, the city penned my heart. The world beyond it, just geography. Until a sudden illness blighted my internal neighborhood. My doctor couldn't name it, knew no medicine but rest. A full year's worth. My parents' friends had read of German sanatoriums. Mine spun the globe and urged gay fantasies. Only Charlotte spoke firsthand. A guest ranch in Frijoles Canyon outside Santa Fe. Beans Canyon? Skepticism was among the luxuries I'd have to learn to do without in heaven's stony hills. What devil took me, or what God? Call it New Mexico, as I did, knowing nothing but the tremors in my heart, a many-chambered conduit I learned for more than blood. The landscape's nudity surprised me. Everywhere, bare rock, clothed only in a shift of shadows, sand pooled deep in dry stream beds, wide gravel washes, deadwood caked with dust, cracked mud, silt ankle deep in drifts beside the rusted rails. Even the air seemed naked, stripped of all humidity, crisp, chill, and intimate. The ranch's battered Packard stuttered north along a washboard road, turned west, and spun its wheels in clouds of alkali. The Rio Grande slid like a sleepy snake, so low between its banks, the worm-etched wooden trestle bridge at Buckman's Siding sang and shrugged its shoulders under us before I saw a drop of water. Land of absences, transparent, vast, a bleached skull's hollow eye, a gulf, a gasp, a window on the void. My flesh drew tight around my bones. Was this the Canaan I abandoned home for? No, I'd dreamed a sham. This place was where God rested on the seventh day. The Packard staggered up a switchback gouged in soft white tuff across a mesa's outer face, and as we rose, the world unfolded like a Mariposa lily's golden heart when clear rain follows years of drought. We reached the mesa's crest and straddled a deeply rutted track back toward the Hamath Range, through juniper and pinyon, stands of arching western pines that shed sweet-scented needles like a cloak to tamp the dust. The road stopped at a canyon's edge. A packhorse grazed thick tufts of grama grass that bowed bright tasseled heads like sieves of light beside a steep trail down the canyon's wheat and coral walls. They formed a crescent, mirroring a little river lined with sun-drenched alders and a stone ranch house. That night, I slept in silence I could feel against my skin. I woke to climb the canyon trail each morning, walk all day among the groves of scrub oak and majestic ponderosa, Indian paintbrush and prickly pear, the spiny cholla's fuchsia blooms, led past the cultivated bounds that had defined my life. The dust itself seemed full of life, not ashes, but dry clay, only wanting rain and artful hands to free its echoes of eternal forms. I walked home under a descending sun that brushed fresh fire on the mountains called the blood of Christ, as liquid turquoise filled the valley like a rough clay bowl, the way an old man's eyes will brim a last time as he dies. Our blood is slaked with earth, each vein that feeds our dusty hearts a trumpet vine entangled in an old salt cedar's arms, calling the newly faithful to a kind of reckoning.
Wonderfully, when I always tell my students detail. I mean, that's just a flourish of wonderfully evocative detail.
That was a very, very fun poem to work on.
How come?
Because of that, because the landscape is enchanting, and this gave me a chance to immerse myself in it in memory and to try to find words that somehow would evoke that experience. And also because Edith Warner is an amazing person, and it was really fun to learn about her, to read about her life, to read some of the things that she had written.